then on the next Sunday, we have the story of the man born blind, and it starts with a question from the disciples who are clueless as to who Jesus really is. Rabbi, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And it turns out that the purpose of the man being born blind is so that the glory of God will be revealed. And for John, the passion narrative is when God is glorified. Father, glorify your Son with the glory I had before the world began. This comes from chapter 12, I believe, as the passion narrative is beginning. Once I was at a parish in Bossier City, Christ the King. It had a glorious crucifix, Jesus in glorified robes. And a lot of people who were used to medieval crucifixes, they didn't understand. They said, but that's not how the cross was. It was gory. It was bloody. It wasn't like that. And Christ wasn't wearing a glorious crown and glorious robes. Well, that's a glorious crucifix, and that's how John sees the crucifixion. That's why priests can't use the same homily for Palm Sunday, when it's the Passion according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as we use on Good Friday. Because for John, the cross is glorious, far more glorious than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so the glory of God for John is revealed in the crucifixion. And Jesus answered, he answers and he assures them, night is coming, and no one can work in the dark. And so we do, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. As John tells the story of the Last Supper, when he says that Judas went out, the next thing he says is, it was night. So while Jesus lived, he did his work, and now that he's risen from the dead, living in a new sense, we, reading the gospel on two levels, we also live in the light of Jesus, even though there's darkness at times in our life. So then he spits and makes mud and puts it on his eyes and says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And I won't bore you with all of the scholarly details, but the Old Testament name for the place is Shiloach, and that means sent. We're not sure if Siloam means sent or not, but Shiloach, what's called in the Old Testament, does. And so the man goes and he washes, that was my Pennsylvania dialect coming out from my mother, washes. he washes in Siloam. That is, as far as John is concerned, he washes in the one who was sent. That is, he washes in Jesus. Jesus is the one who is sent by God. And so then he comes to see, and people start wondering, well, how did he see? And he starts out, the man called Jesus. So that's all he knows about him at this point. The man called Jesus. He made clay, he smeared it on me, and he said, go wash, and I washed, and now I see. And then we have the enemies of Jesus coming into the story. And the irony is, as the story goes on, the man sees more and more clearly, and the enemies of Jesus get more and more blind. So it's going this way, more and more seeing, more and more blindness. And some say, this man, Jesus, he's not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. See, Jesus healed him on the Sabbath. And they said, well, what do you say about him? You're the one he healed, and he said, he is a prophet. So notice the man doesn't say, he's a man named Jesus. Now, I say he is a prophet. And so they don't believe, and they check with the parents, and Is this your son? And was he born blind? And how does he see? And they say, well, yeah, he's our son. He was born blind. And how he sees, we don't know. He's old enough. Ask himself. And the story is that they were afraid of the Jews. And here, notice, they're afraid of the Jews. Most of the time, John uses the Jews to mean the enemies of Jesus. But think about it. Wasn't Jesus a Jew? Weren't all of his apostles Jews? Wasn't the parents and all their friends, weren't they all Jews? But it's really, they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And it said they had agreed they were going to throw anyone who believed in Jesus out of the synagogue. Well, historians tell us that this did not actually happen during the lifetime of Jesus. It happened some decades after his death and resurrection. But when John is writing, he's writing on two different levels. It's kind of like, I'm old enough to remember MASH, which was supposed to be about the war in Korea, but it was on TV in the 60s, and what it was really about was the war in Vietnam. So these parents, for John, they really represent Christians 30 or 40 years after the resurrection, and who they believe in Jesus, but they're afraid to say it publicly. And so they're afraid of the leadership of the Jews, and so that's why they said, ask him, he's old enough. And so John is writing to encourage Christians like this to be more brave, to profess their faith. And then they say, we know that this man is a sinner. The enemies say that. And one of my teachers, John Meyer, God rest him, he said, whenever somebody says they know something in John, they're usually wrong. And again, this is the audience. John's audience gets the joke. They've heard this story many times, and so they have a good laugh when they hear they're so sure. We know this man is a sinner. Well, how wrong can you be? And he says, one thing I know, I was blind, and now I see. That, by the way, is where the song Amazing Grace, that inspired that song. John Newton, who ran a slave ship, and God opened his eyes and helped him to see what he was doing was wicked, and he completely changed his life, quit owning a slave ship, became an abolitionist, and he wrote that song, I was blind, but now I see. That's also what this story is about. It's not just about someone receiving sight, it's about receiving insight into who Jesus is. And so then they say, well, we know about Moses, but we don't even know where he's from. And the man says, well, this is really something. You don't know where he's from. Well, in the Gospel of John, people will argue about, well, was Jesus from Bethlehem or was Jesus from Nazareth? Because the story is he was born in Bethlehem, but he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. For John, the important thing is Jesus is from above. And unless you get that, you might know which town, but that doesn't make any difference at all. What is important is Jesus is from above. And unless you know where Jesus is from, you don't know squat as far as John is concerned. You don't know where he's from. And they admit, we don't know where he's from. So even his enemies are telling the truth. We think he's from one of the local towns, but he's from above. We don't know where he's from. So you have to know all of the in-jokes to really appreciate John. And so the poor man gets thrown out, and finally Jesus meets up with him again. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, Son of Man, 99.9% of the time, it's a way of saying fragile human being, a child of Adam and Eve. mortal human being. But whenever the Gospels use Son of Man as a title, they're not thinking of the 99.9% verses of the Old Testament. They're thinking of chapter 7 in the book of Daniel, where he's had visions of heavenly creatures, and there's a vision of one who is like a son of man, and this one is going to judge the world in God's name. And that is what John means when he says, when Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Jesus is asking, do you believe in the one who's going to judge the world in God's name? And the man says, who is he, sir? Kyrie, could mean Lord, but he's probably just being polite at this point. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, the one speaking to you, I am he. Again, I am, that double meaning. And he says, I do believe, Lord, and he worshiped him. And that's the appropriate response. Once we know who Jesus is, we worship him. And then the enemies come, and Jesus says, I came to the world for judgment, that those who do not see might see, and that those who see might become blind. So notice, those who see might see, and those who don't might become more blind. And judgment, for the other Gospels, that's something that's going to happen on the last day. But only in John do we hear Jesus say, and this is the judgment of the world. Not Son of Man's going to come on clouds on the last day. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people prefer darkness to light. The judgment occurs whenever someone is confronted with the person of Jesus. They have to make the decision, and that's a life and death decision. The most important decision they will ever make in their life. That's the judgment. And that's the judgment of the world. And it occurs when people met Jesus during his lifetime, but it also occurs for us and others who read the Gospel of John whenever we hear the Word of God proclaimed, or whenever we approach sacraments. We are approaching Jesus whenever we see him approach Jesus in the least of his brothers and sisters, and in the poor that we might be tempted to ignore. Now is the judgment of the world. How do we respond to Jesus in this situation? And they say, the enemies say, well, surely you're not saying we're blind. And he said, if you were blind, you wouldn't have a sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains. And I have to admit that people who are absolutely certain scare me to death. And so a little bit of humility about being certain, I would say, not just for the leaders of the Jews, but also for us who are Christians, to admit that even though we have a relationship with Jesus, we don't know everything. And that gives us more tolerance and respect for other religions who see things differently than we do. But the point is that God has called us to recognize Jesus Christ and who he really is. So that's what we have on the story of the man born blind, who is a symbol for every human being. We're all born blind, and we only slowly start seeing the light, and God has called us to live in the light of Jesus. That's what people preparing for baptism and the Easter sacraments need to hear.